Trends seem to circulate faster than ever before thanks to social media. But just because butterboards and baked sheet pan sushi might be everywhere on TikTok, does that translate to print books? Welcome to Everything Cookbooks, the podcast for readers, writers, and cooks. I'm Kate Leahy, and today I'm here with Kristin and Molly. Hey, everyone.
Hey. Hi, Kate. Kristin.
So this is actually also our last episode of 2023. So I can't wait to talk a little bit about trends and then also maybe what we have in store for 2024. But before we get into that, let's go back to my original question about food trends. I mean, Kristin, you used to work at Food and Wine. How important were food trends? How much time did you spend with food trends?
Food trends were basically currency, Food and Wine, or that's like how I think about them now, because our coverage was often very trend driven. And sometimes that meant trends that started in restaurants. Other times it was trends that started maybe in like specialty food. But I was always looking for trends and always, pitching them. And it would basically be like if you identified something first, it was a big deal.
Oh, so if you were the first one to say, like, what would be a trend? Do you remember a trend that you identified that you were super excited about?
Yeah. So I have a little secret for identifying trends, which in this world, it's hard to know if it's still the same just because we have information coming at us so quickly all the time. But, trends go in cycles. And I feel like when you start to sense that it's been such a long time since there was something, it often comes back. For example, basically the death of the butcher shop. It felt like so many old school butchers had closed. There were just a few remaining. And I was like, there must be some young people who are really interested in butchery. And so, I just started doing some internet research and then found, sure enough, they say 3 is a trend. So it'd be like, I found my 3 shops. So we did a story all about the new school of butchers.
I remember that time because there were all of a sudden in every sort of, a type of neighborhood or city or town that had sort of a, for lack of a better term, a hipster vibe, like flannel shirts, beanies, that there was that artisanal butcher shop.
Yeah.
And it happened really fast.
It did. And there was already like an artisanaling of so many other things. So it just made sense to me that there's got to be butcher shops out there. But again, this is really before social media. So it was doing a lot of deep Googling instead.
Yeah.
I also feel like it used to be trends would start in restaurants and then trickle down. You'd see that was sort of something that was talked about, that you would follow what's happening in restaurants and then we'd see it appearing in home cooking recipes, books and things like that. And I am not a trend spotter, but certainly a trend watcher. And I feel like that's not true anymore so much. I mean, certainly it's still true to some point, but things also come up from home cooks.
I agree with
I
that.
think that it just reminds me of The Devil Wears Prada, the movie where, I know it was based on a book, but I'm thinking about the movie and there's
with the cerulean?
Yes, there's a scene with Meryl Streep and she is basically explaining where trends come from and how the cheap blue belt or sweater or whatnot, the reason that blue is in vogue was because so-and-so, and it just traces back the trend. It started on this high end and now it's an Old Navy, and she was very dismissive of that. And that was how I remember something would happen in restaurants. Burrata was an example. Burrata started off in restaurants and then it burrata. Now it doesn't even feel, there's nothing fresh to say about burrata. There probably is. It just feels like it kind of got to a saturation point. But you're right. That's not how trends kind of circulate these days.
Yeah.
It feels like they can start from many sources of inspiration. And you mentioned butterboards, which I don't know where the idea of a butterboard totally came from, but I know that at least the major TikToks trend, it was Justine Snacks sharing a recipe from a book. So it actually kind of started with a book, which is pretty cool.
That really is interesting. Okay, so since you mentioned social media, which is the big elephant in the room when it comes to food trends right now at this moment in December 2023, What do we think about social media? Like, I'm thinking about when I think of a, say, TikTok food trend, it's what you said, butterboards. It's nacho tables where you see somebody like put out an entire table, cover it with foil, and instead of it being like a crawfish boil, it's nachos on the table. That's one I've seen. There's also when you take like a deli sandwich and you chop it up really fine, so it looks like a really messy chopped salad. But I feel like a chopped salad might be better. I don't know. And then, things that are like mashups, like you have tuna pizza waffle. Like, what is that? I don't know, but it's a mashup and it's like, ooh, I want to know what that is. So this is just, to me, it can make your brain crazy if you're trying to figure out what is going to have sort of a long-term lasting impact on the way we eat and what is one of these flash in the pan, unicorn, rainbow everything, and then you forget about it in a year. Mm-hmm. What do you think? Like, where is this all going?
Oh, man. It's so funny because I realized I was actually a little exhausted by trends when I was like interviewing to do this project that was about identifying trends. And they were like, yeah, you just should set up a separate TikTok account to use it just for watching food trends. And I was like, well, I don't want to do that.
Yeah.
So, gosh, what's going to have legs? I guess if it's really delicious, right? I don't know. Molly, do you have some thoughts there?
It's entertaining. I find it entertaining.
It can be, yeah.
I mean, it can be, but it can also be, there's that revulsion is too strong of a word, but sometimes I see things. I'm like, oh gosh, you talk about charcuterie boards or butter boards. We started with, but charcuterie boards are something that have changed. I mean, charcuterie has been around for a very, very long time. Yes. Putting sliced meats and cheeses out to serve people, forever. But this super curated, everything chopped up, made into a design that looks like, there are competitions for this where and I just have this don't touch my,
there's I always think about the hands. I'm like,
the mortadella roses aren't.
Yeah, and I'm sure there, people, using gloves and doing it in a sanitary manner or whatever. But there's something overwrought about so many trends, and but at the same time, we want to strive for new ideas. We want to strive for things that, not me personally, I don't know that I've ever thought, oh, what if I went viral? What if one of my recipes went viral? I know that that's a goal for some people. And I can't say it's ever happened. So I don't know what kind of rush comes along with that. But I don't think anybody who creates a trend knows they've created a trend, because it's not a trend the first time. And I'm sure we've all seen people going on social media saying, I did this first, sort of thing. And
yeah.
Those sort of sour grapes, to me, it doesn't matter if you did it first.
Right.
It's cool if you can really claim it, but what makes a trend stick? We don't know.
Right.
Yeah. I do think there's probably a deliciousness factor, right? Like something like burrata is a great example where,
we hope, yes.
Yeah, where once people try it, you're like, wow, that's just really delicious. Where some of these other things, I don't know, using cheese as a wrapper, it's like, it's delicious, but it's greasy. Like, is that actually tasty?
Right.
There's a lot of stunty food on TikTok.
Stunty food,
right.
that's a
stunty
good,
food. Yes, yeah. It's interesting using the burrata as an example, but there's ingredients that become trendy, which is a kind of trend, but the recipe or the dish or the stunt or the nacho board, with burrata, it became available at the same time. It became popular, then it became available, then it went from being a trend to just being, I don't say commonplace, but
right.
Whereas there's a new trend, or not new, but a recent trend of people watching trends, like watching TikToks and then doing those reaction videos to them.
Yeah.
Wow, this is very meta. I feel. I'm thinking, well, I have a couple of thoughts. One thought is raspberry vinaigrette needs to come back because that was a huge thing and then it got so tired. But I feel like it could have a moment now.
Yeah.
I think it was if it was like really fresh, not like I could see like a homemade raspberry vinegar.
Right. Like we're talking about food, like ingredient trends. And then like Martha Holmberg, when she was on the episode.
That.
Yeah. Sun-dried tomatoes, poor beleaguered sun-dried tomatoes. They deserve, a little love.
I just did a recipe for a white bean dip with sun-dried tomatoes, actually, in Real Food, the magazine. I was thinking that. I was like, sun-dried tomatoes.
So it seems that, we can say there's stunt food, and then there's sort of ingredients that maybe find a new life, or ingredients that just have more availability. So they just become sort of more commonplace. But let's kind of pivot back to cookbooks and how trends either impact cookbooks. Can a trend drive a cookbook? We can start with charcuterie boards. One thing with, I think it's that cookbook Beautiful Boards, it's still selling like crazy. And it has also spawned a lot of interest in publishers who want their version of that book. They want a version of like these curated boards where it's that idea of great taste and flavor but it's more about curation and not spending hours cooking in the kitchen. I think that's where it fits into this idea of like people want great taste, but they don't want to spend all these hours in the kitchen like they did during the pandemic. There's also that sort of like girl dinner trend where you can have crackers and cheese. And what do we think? Like our charcuterie board books, that seems like a trend, I would think maybe with a longer term potential.
It's almost like a genre at this point, I feel. I've actually used this as an example in the class, like when I teach people about writing cookbook proposals, to not necessarily panic if their idea is done. You might want to panic if somebody does your idea and it doesn't sell well. But like if your idea is done and it's selling well and it's popular, like then publishers, just like you said, they're going to want their version of that. So I don't know. I think there were like 10 different versions of this book already. And then I saw charcuterie boards for dogs.
I've seen seacouterie for seafood. Yeah.
I was thinking about Hard Knocks, the HBO series that goes behind the scenes of an NFL team. And they were filming the Jets this offseason. And these players got together. It was like the offensive or defensive linemen. And they all got together just to hang out. And one of them was really into charcuterie. And they wanted to teach the other linemen on, I think it was a defensive lineman, on how to make these boards. And someone was like, chocroute? What the heck is this? And it was just like kind of endearing. I don't know. But then a trend has jumped the shark.
I get it's funny though, because that is it's like a business for some people where they teach people how to make them. They have workshops. And then obviously then there's people who are like really crafty and they make boards of all sizes. But I was going to say, I think there's another book coming out called Everyday Snack Board to address maybe people who like the idea of eating snacks, but don't necessarily want to have to impress visually. I don't know. I love how you can just constantly like, well, what's a twist on it that resonates for me?
Right. Or what's the overriding, like the charcuterie board, the snack board, the girl dinner, what connects all of those? And it's this idea of, snack-based eating or curated snack, sort of look for a more broad topic that encompasses a couple trends.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I feel like that way with slow drinks. Danny Childs, who we just spoke to, where he wasn't chasing a trend or anything like that, but drinks, including non-alcoholic drinks, but craft cocktails, that's very big. But then also people getting more into foraging and botanicals, that's very big. So bringing those things together into a book worked well.
That's a synthesis of thinking. So if you're trying to figure out where things are going, when you're looking at social media, when you're reading a food magazine, when you're reading the food section of your local newspaper or the New York Times, or to use your brain to synthesize, to have that kind of, instead of just going, oh, there's that thing, but to sort of, I don't know, I'm not articulating this as well, but to step back and connect the dots, however that works for you, whether it's a Google sheet, whether it's just I could sort of see myself doing a drawing of the various things I see and then trying to step back and like almost let your eyes blur and say, what am I seeing that, what's happening here? That sort of thing. Is it ingredient driven? Is it plant-based? Where are people going? Because what you don't want is to, we talk about the long term, and we'll talk more about that, playing the long game. But if you're trying to get a book that's really on trend, you don't want to miss it.
Yeah. I think it used to be when publishers notice trends, and we'll talk a little bit more about how publishers pay attention to trends, but it used to be, say, the publisher would say, we need smoothie book. So they would hire somebody, maybe it was a work for hire, and they would pay a food writer, recipe developer to develop, say, 40 smoothie recipes, which is a lot of smoothie recipes when you think about it. And maybe that person just gets paid one lump sum. They never get royalties, but the publisher has kind of tested out, making sure they have a product that fits the smoothie smoothie market. And that's one way it used to be. Nowadays, I would think that if a publisher wanted a smoothie book, they would go after an influencer who had a platform based on smoothies. So they would guarantee that it wasn't just the publisher who's trying to sell this book and it's sort of it's almost an anonymous author. It's more that the publisher wants to publish this book and use that platform to help sell more copies.
Yes. I mean, I think there's still a little bit of the first way where they find the author, but it's true. If there is somebody who is already building an audience around that topic, I would imagine they'd go for that person first. So, something I wanted to bring up that I think when I was debating taking on this trend project, it just hit me it's like, well, a trend for whom, right? Oh. So we're in the United States, so it's often for people in the US. But I just saw McCormick release their flavor of the year and it's tamarind, and I was like, tamarind's for, I think, billions of people, a daily ingredient. And here it's ooh, look at this. It's novel. It's new. And so I just think that's just something to, when talking about trends, to be a little mindful of who is this a trend for? And
right. Good point. And it's not only parts of the world, but it's also age demographic. Something that is a trend maybe for my parents' generation is not going to be necessarily a trend for the Gen Z generation or my generation. So, and I think a lot of trend reporting is focused on what the Gen Z, the millennials it used to be everyone wanted to know what the millennials wanted. Now they all want to know what Gen Z wants. And the thing is, there's a lot of other people out there outside of those demographics. So I think that's another thing that when you're looking at social media, it skews maybe more Gen Z. But are those the people who are actually buying, say, cookbooks?
But they are buying snacks. I think it's funny because I think sometimes that's a lot of these food trends. There's organizations trying to predict trends to sell that information to food companies, so they can create their tamarind snack or whatever. So Gen Z is buying snacks anyway.
Right. And I will welcome tamarind snacks. I think tamarind is a lovely...
100%.
Yes.
I love it. It's actually one of my favorite flavors.
Yeah.
That can be, I guess, a good thing about naming something a trend is then it becomes more widely available as an ingredient.
Well, yeah. And then there are the people who, the trend setters, the trend makers, the people who, very deliberately use their influence to make something fetch, as we used to say.
That's so fetch. Stop trying to make fetch happen, Molly.
But, and then the difference between a trend and a shift in just a more general change in attitude or something. I mean, I would hardly say that plant-based eating is a trend.
Agree.
It's a shift. It has happened. It's happening. I can't imagine. I mean, sure, there'll be ebb and flow, but I just can't imagine in the next several decades us going anywhere but more focused on that.
Same with non-alcoholic cocktails.
Absolutely.
I think that's just going to continue to grow and there's going to be more innovation.
Alternate flours,
Right.
grains. Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit, though, on how this affects publishing, because we know how long it takes a book to get out in the world. It's only under very special circumstances where a book will go from, say, turning in the whole manuscript to published in a matter of months. Those are for very highly sort of anticipated, specialized, maybe celebrity books. I'm sure they rushed to print the Britney memoir as fast as they could because they knew that book was going to sell bazillions of copies.
Right. And your example of the smoothie book, those, we have colleagues who've written books like that. That was, okay, you have 2 months, you have 3 months, you have a very short timeline to turn around and deliver these 30, 40 smoothie recipes. You're not getting a royalty because that book is not intended to stick around. It's just going to grab a moment, sell like hotcakes, and then be done.
Right. So in general, publishers aren't necessarily the best ones to identify trends oftentimes because they have such long lead times and they're usually working a couple of years in advance. It's very hard to predict what book is going to hit 2 years from now. So you can go with your gut, you can use research, but if you personally see a trend coming, the publisher still might turn you down because they don't see the trend coming. So it's not the easiest. If you, in your gut, know that this is going to be big. I can think of an example. There was very few books being greenlit about tacos, where there was not much happening in tacos. This is about a decade ago. And I remember asking publishers, and I said, this is there's so many great, creative people out there, they're grinding their own masa, they're doing this and that. And they're like, well, that might be happening now, but we can't necessarily, pull the trigger on something. We don't know what it's going to be like in 2 years. We can look at past sales records, which is what they use a lot of times to identify what books are going to sell. And they can say, we had these Mexican cookbooks. They didn't really sell that well unless you were on TV. Not fair. But that's kind of the old traditional model. And I feel like still publishing is in that old traditional model. I don't know. Is it changing? Are you seeing change?
It's like, this is something I don't want to be a trend, but I'm seeing publishers lately, it feels like taking more risks, trying to bring in more voices, more different types of food, go deeper on different types of food that weren't always explored, I mean, again, I think we've talked about Italian food, and that's just a perennial seller in the United States. People love Italian food, but things that are less well known, it does feel like publishers are open to that. And I'm hoping that's not a trend. I'm hoping, again, like Molly said, that's a shift in the way we do things.
When we talked to Matt Rodbard about Koreatown, Korea World that he did with Doogie Hong, and how he had such a hard time getting that first book, Koreatown, published because he was told it was too niche. And it's like...
Yeah, and a trend. Like, they thought it was a passing trend,
right.
Korean food. And it's like an entire cuisine. That's another thing. Like, calling entire cuisines trends,
right?
It bothers me.
Yeah.
But I actually think he was sort of, it's a shift.
Right. That's a shift. And that's a good point where he saw this happening and he had to work really hard to convince publishers that it was something that was going to last. And then, the book ended up, I think, on the New York Times bestseller list. And then it was proof of concept. And all of a sudden, have you noticed that ever since there's been pretty much every year, there's a few great Korean books that come out.
Yeah.
And it's a steadily growing kind of, it's becoming its own genre. So
Totally.
That's also very exciting to see. And I think that's what we're seeing more, that might be, if there's butterboard cookbooks that are coming out there, nothing wrong. If you're writing a butterboard cookbook, you go for it. But, capitalize on that trend. I don't know 10 years from now if people are going to want to publish butterboards. Who knows?
Yeah.
Maybe it becomes its own thing. You love everything cookbooks, right? And we love making it for you. Here's your chance to help us keep it going. Go to everythingcookbooks.com/support. There you'll find links to all our new great merch, including t-shirts, sweatshirts, even a hat, and our bookstore where we earn commission on every book you buy. You can also leave us a review wherever you listen to the show. Again, that's everythingcookbooks.com/support to find all the ways to show us the love. And thanks for listening.
It's funny. We're using the word trend, and I also, we're talking about things that aren't trends too. We're talking about things that are, trying to teach people about food that they might not have known about before, or that sort of thing. But the trend is having books that don't just look like the books that were in my cookbook library 40 years ago, right? And that publishing is very slow to move, and I think that would be a trend in publishing now, is that publishing seems like it's moving a little more quickly. I mean, another conversation we could have are what are the trends in cookbook publishing, because that's a separate conversation. But
right.
And I think we might be mixing up a little bit. I think I am when I start thinking about
We should do that for 2024. Do an episode on cookbook trends, like sort of single subject, this, that, the other thing. But for now, thinking about food trends and thinking about it in the most generic way. When you're thinking a trend, you mean we're going to be talking, okay, in the past, trend cookbooks that have sold really well have been special diet cookbooks, like the Atkins diet. And then people were like, I want to do this diet. I need a book. Or, more recently, the Whole30. I mean, any kind of cookbook that embraced Whole30 sold really well. So those are I would say they're trend books. They're perennial trends. There's always going to be that next level health sort of thing that people want to try, and then they need recipes. So that's sort of a trend genre.
Well, and then they branded those things. So then it was like, you couldn't just write a Whole30 cookbook probably without licensing.
Yeah.
So you had to sort of dance around what you called it.
And I also going back to why we decided to talk about this in an episode is because we know that a lot of our listeners want to write cookbooks or are working on cookbooks and are looking for a great idea, right? And so sometimes you look around and you think, I know I really want to write a cookbook. What's a good idea? Back to episode 1 or 2 or whatever. And sometimes that does mean looking for something that you think might capture the public's imagination or taste. Just make sure you know a lot about it, right?
Make sure you know a lot about it. And what I'm wondering is, can book based on a trend be great? Because I was just looking at all these like best of lists. Most of those books are very individual. It's because of the author, because of their expertise and their special flavor that they bring to something. I feel like that's why they end up on those lists. So I was just trying to mull, like, can a trend-based book be great?
I would say it might not need to, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. And I think the reason to do a trend book is A, you like the trend.
Yeah.
And B, if it's going to be a lucrative thing that pays you money, you want to do it, and you have the capacity to do it, and you're getting the opportunity, why not? And I'm thinking about anybody who really was able to capitalize on the Instant Pot cookbook sort of genre when it was in its height. You know, some of those books, their first print run would be maybe 70,000 copies. I mean, that's bananas. But if you're able to sustain a business because you have this, hey, it could be a hit in this genre. Maybe you could run the risk of getting typecast as somebody who only writes these books. However, you're making a living as a writer. And I think that's also something that's pretty cool. So sometimes I look at the best of lists and they do have that sort of individual, a lot of them have that sort of really passionate story or real unique sort of approach to a subject or a family story or a way to cook. But you know, when you think of the broader audience that buys cookbooks, oftentimes they might be looking for something else. And there's no shame in going after that market.
It's actually reminding me of your chat with Bonnie Van Wyck. She specifically wrote the article about Joanna Gaines and the Magnolia Table and all that. But basically, sometimes the food press is not always in touch with the general public, right?
True.
Right. So is there any final words for somebody who might be really into a particular trend they're seeing and are thinking of what it would take to craft a book around it? Anything we'd want to tell them that maybe things to look into, things to think through before going in that direction?
I do think it is useful when you're writing a proposal to try to make a case that there is a trend of some sort that will help propel your book. And, you know, that can be like looking at what's going on in restaurants. It could be things like Google Trends, you know, looking at what articles have been done in the last year that might fall into the kinds of food you do. It doesn't necessarily need to be something that everybody's talking about. It kind of goes back to Molly's idea of like synthesizing. But I think that is important because, you know, you want to say like people are already interested in these things and this book fills that. And actually, Molly, I'm thinking about, you know, when you wrote all about braising, you pitched that book a while before it was published. And I remember you saying like braising wasn't a word.
Right.
But could you see that it was coming or were you just...
Yeah, it's interesting because I'm thinking about it in light of this conversation, what you said earlier, Kristin, about nostalgia. And I think that was why I chose braising. I mean, I chose braising because I love braising, but it's such an old technique and it's so ingrained in anybody who, you know, has cooked for a long time. Sort of home cooking, professional cooking. So I believed in it. I was like, this is not going away. But there were no books on braising. There were books on stewing that would encompass braising. There were chapters on braising in sort of, so it was I guess it was a risk, or it was sort of like, I don't know why nobody's ever done this. But when I pitched the book, and I know I've told this story on the podcast, but just so you're saying, Chris, the word was not common. Yeah. And while I was working on the book, I don't know if the New York Times, I'm sure it still does, the magazine does they did alphabetical. A is for B is for the trends of the year. And that right before I turned it in, B was for braising.
Wow.
Oh my gosh.
And I like called up my editor. I'm like, well, you know, jumping up and down because the word started to become common. And when the book came out, within 2 years, there were 2 more braising books that other people were working on before mine came out. So it was like, it was this little moment. I didn't predict it, but it was back to looking for something that, you know, was not going away, but perhaps is undercovered or it has been not represented in cookbooks.
That reminds me of some of the books that came out well before the pandemic about baking with sourdough starter and how those books just shot up in sales. They had already been strong sellers, but it's a classic subject that was getting renewed attention. I don't know how many copies that Ken Forkish's baking books have sold, but I'm imagining it's quite a number. And that's something to think about, too, if you're embarking on something. Personally, I wouldn't chase a trend book for my own name because it wouldn't make sense with what I do. And I feel like it would just confuse sort of like, what does she write about? She writes about this, and now she writes about that. But if I'd built sort of a platform on something, I think it would make sense, because you want that book to stay in print for a while. So you want to think about, do I want this? Like, I think we've all sort of talked about, how does this fit into who you are? But I really like, Kristin, what you mentioned, that no matter what kind of book you imagine yourself writing, thinking about how it fits into the world today, that's a really strong part of your proposal. There's going to be that section, why this book now? Mm-hmm. And the way you do that isn't because I want to write this book now. You talk about sort of these other macro and micro factors happening in the world that can make your argument stronger. Quick note, Google Trends. Kristin, you brought that up. What is the best way to leverage that when you are, say, either looking for trends or looking for like information to plug into a proposal?
Well, so let's say you wanted to write a book about snacking boards. I mean, it's already a trend, right? We know it, but you could definitely go into Google Trends and see the search volume. And I think it's updated monthly, and how it has moved over time. But then maybe you expand out from there. So you mentioned girl dinner. Girl dinner is a trend. I might also go to TikTok. Like, how many times has that been mentioned on TikTok? And another thing is there's something called eRank, and you can search like what people are looking for on Etsy, and I believe also Amazon. So if there's anything that's like in your wheelhouse, I feel like you can use that to just get an idea of what people are looking for and places where they might be underserved.
Listening to that, that's super helpful. That would be what I would use once I've already decided on the cookbook idea and I'm trying to write my proposal and say why this book now, not how I'm going to come up with my cookbook proposal.
I agree. And or if you're deciding between a couple of ideas, that's another potential use for it. But it's true. I think of using things like eRank or even Google Trends, like if you just want to like create a quick product to fill a hole in the market, but a book is not a quick product.
Right. But a great way to justify, in your proposal, why this book now, you might find substantiating information there. Yeah, I think
that's really good. Just to think also, sometimes you get an idea for a book and you're just like, oh my God, this is going to just be so great. And I can't wait to tell everybody about it. And you haven't really sat with it long enough. And then you just can't wait. You're going to tell your agent, or you're going to tell your editor, you're just going to tell your best friend, your dog, I don't know. And then everyone kind of looks at you like, I'll go back to my koji fermented ice cream example, which makes no sense in this context, but just because it's just sort of like, that would be a very niche book. But I'm like, I'm going to be the first one to do this book. And maybe if I had just sat on that idea for a couple of weeks, maybe think it through, like what a proposal would look like, what it would be like to write this book. And then I go into looking at the trends. That might be a better kind of way to approach things. Just because I think sometimes you get this idea and you think it's so exciting. Maybe in a week, it's not that a new shiny object anymore.
It's more for you. I was going to say more like, be careful of who you tell, because some people are not in your world. And they're going to say, oh, no, I don't know anything about that.
Oh, true.
And I would also say, when you say be careful who you tell, not because you think someone's going to steal the idea. I just don't. No. I've heard people say that. It's like, well, I don't want to tell you because, somebody might take. It's like, that's not a reality for me. You're going to do it the way you do it, and people are going to find out about it anyway. I just don't think that idea that you have a secret.
Yeah. I think this has been a fun chat about trends. I mean, we went all over the place, and maybe by the end of this episode, after you're done listening to it, skinny jeans will be back in. So I don't know. Lots of things can happen. So, to wrap up our episode, since it's our end of the year, I just wanted to know, let's talk a little bit about any sort of things you're really excited to do in 2024, whether that's hobbies, new projects, any goals. What comes to mind, Molly?
Well, I have to say this host chat. We don't do as many of them as we used to, and I really do enjoy I love our guests, but I think it's really fun to talk among us and get Andrea back on too. But I'm just super excited about where the podcast is going and the community that we're building and the Insider series that we're producing. And I didn't know a year ago where we'd be with this. And now, episode 75, I just am excited about next year for Everything Cookbooks is a big part of my 2024.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So crazy.
You can't beat that answer.
Yeah.
That's an amazing answer. Kristen, what about you?
I agree, Molly. I'm excited. We are going to do more workshops next year. We've done, I think, 3 or so far, and just try to get more into the nitty gritty in ways that can help our listeners. And I, too, am very excited about that. And then personally, I have a book collaboration deadline in July, and I am very excited to move that along.
Great.
That's great.
I think that if anyone does have ideas for things that they would love to see in our Insider series, to send us an email through Everything Cookbooks, and we will take that into consideration. If it's something about the cookbook writing craft, if it's something about building platforms, anything like that you are excited for more information in a way that we can give in our Insider series, let us know. We'd love to hear your feedback. As far as I agree with everything Molly and Kristen said about this podcast. I love this community. All of our listeners, I'm so grateful for all of you. So thank you for that. And then on a personal note, I am finishing up a manuscript for my very first novel. So that means that I still have a long way to go to edit it and all that. So that is what I'm really excited to do personally in 2024, is really give it that real shape of a book. So
that's so cool.
Learning the craft from a whole different side. And that's been really interesting because I feel like, this is the stuff that took me a while to learn writing cookbooks. And now I have to learn sort of starting from scratch with fiction.
That's great.
Oh, and another thing I'm super excited about is to help people write their cookbook proposals starting in January. I have an 8-week class going, and we are going to dive deep into proposal writing and also how to pitch it to an agent. So if that is interesting at all to you, you can find more info at kristendonnelly.com.
Cool. And do you have a wait, if it fills up or when it fills up, will you have a wait list for?
Yes. So it's open to 20 students. There will be a wait list. And if you sign up for my email list, I'll have a lot more information.
I want to go back and start all over and be a aspiring cookbook author and listen to this podcast and take Kristen's class and start all over again.
I wish I had Kristen's class, when I started out, because my first proposal was pretty rough. Yeah. I'll be honest. What a great resource. And it also shows that, you can start with your idea and you can keep learning and you can keep building on it and create it and, turn it into an actual book someday. So very, very exciting. Thank you both for talking with me about trends and burrata and raspberry vinaigrette and all the fun stuff. I'm going to get some sun-dried tomatoes and look up Martha's recipe now. I think it was for cabbage rolls, which is perfect this time.
Nacho cheese boards
awesome.
I'm going to leave
for
the nacho
New Year's
cheese
Eve, everyone.
Or baked potato bars.
Baked potato bars.
I remember
I
those.
wrote an article about baked potato bars.
Yeah, well, let's bring them back because that sounds delicious.
Yeah,
absolutely.
I'm here for it.
Okay.
I'm here for it. Yeah. Sponsored by the Idaho Potato Foundation. Just kidding. Just kidding. That is great. Thanks, everyone. And that's a wrap.
Kate, thanks for doing this.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for listening to Everything Cookbooks. For more info and ways to support us, go to our website, everythingcookbooks.com. The show is available wherever you get your audio, and if you like what you hear, please leave us a review. It really helps other people find the show. Any book mentioned here can be found on our affiliate page at bookshop.org. Thanks again, as always, to our editor, Abby Cirquitella. And until next time and next year, keep on writing, reading, and cooking.